Imagine you grew everything you ate. Every vegetable, grain, and piece of fruit you consume came from your land and your labor. Your neighbor does the same, completely self-sufficient. Then one day you notice something. You're very good at growing wheat. He's very good at raising chickens. You have too much wheat and not enough eggs. He has too many eggs and not enough flour. So you swap. Everybody wins. That single act of exchange is the oldest economic transaction in human history. It predates money by thousands of years. It existed before writing. And the story of how it became a $32 trillion global trading system looks almost nothing like the version you were taught in school. Here's the version most people know. Humans started with barter. Then they invented money because barter was inefficient. Trade routes were developed, then contracts and free markets. A clean, logical progression from primitive to sophisticated. The problem is, the first part is almost entirely wrong. The myth of the barter economy is one of the most persistent errors in economic history, popularized largely by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Smith described primitive societies trading arrows for meat, constructing a logical foundation for why money was eventually invented. The story was elegant, intuitive, and almost completely unsupported by evidence. Anthropologist David Graeber spent years combing through the historical and archaeological record for his 2011 book, Debt: The First 5,000 Years, and found something remarkable. There is no evidence of any society that operated primarily through barter as its default economic system. Not one. The societies that Smith imagined, haggling over every transaction, simply did not exist. What actually came before money was something far more interesting and far more human. It was debt, in the earliest complex settlements on records, and this is going back to Mesopotamia around 3500 BC. Economic exchange was not conducted through swapping physical goods on the spot. It was conducted through obligation, through memory and social trust. A farmer would bring grain to his central temple storehouse. A record would be kept, often on a clay tablet, of what he had contributed. When he needed something, oil, tools, or labor, he would draw against that record. The exchange was not simultaneous. It was not barter. It was a credit system, a ledger, an acknowledgement that value had been given and that value would be returned. This is why the earliest writing ever found is not poetry, history, or religious texts. It is accounting. Clay tablets from Uruk, dated to roughly 3100 BC. They contain recordings of the quantities of grain and beer and animals flowing in and out of temple storehouses. The first thing humans decided was important enough to write down was not a story, it was a balance sheet. Trade did not evolve from barter to money. It evolved from social obligation and memory, through increasingly complex record-keeping, toward physical tokens that could represent stored value. The coin was not the solution to barter. It was a portable, anonymous version of the temple ledger. And that detail matters enormously, because it means trade has always been, at its core, about one thing above everything else: trust. And every major development in trade history, every innovation and institution that made trade bigger, faster, or more complex was a solution to one specific problem. How do you trade with someone you do not know and cannot fully trust? Your neighbor you know. You've watched him tend his chickens for years. Trust between neighbors is enforced by proximity and repetition. But what happens when you want to trade with someone 3 days' walk away? Someone you've never met, will never meet again, and whose reputation you cannot verify. That is the problem that built the ancient trade routes. And solving it required not just infrastructure, but an entire set of social technologies most people have never heard of. The Silk Road, the network connecting China to the Mediterranean, active from roughly 130 BC through the 1450s, is the most famous example. But it wasn't primarily about silk. And it wasn't essentially a road. It was a solution to the trust problem at civilizational scale. Merchants developed one of the earliest forms of the trade contract, a written agreement specifying what was being exchanged, at what price, under what conditions, and what recourse existed if one party failed to deliver. Those contracts were enforced not by governments, since most of them had no jurisdiction along the full route at the time. Instead, they were enforced by merchant networks and guilds that operated their own reputational systems. Cheat someone on the Silk Road and your name would travel ahead of you, arriving in the next city before you did, closing doors and cutting off future business. The contract was the mechanism, reputation was the enforcement. The system was so effective that trade credit instruments were being used along these routes as early as the 9th century. A merchant in Baghdad could deposit gold with a trusted partner, receive a written certificate, travel thousands of miles, and exchange that certificate for goods without carrying a single coin. This instrument, known as the sakk in Arabic, is the direct ancestor of the modern bank cheque. The word itself, passed through Italian merchants, is where the English word cheque comes from. The people who controlled these trust mechanisms, the temples, the guilds, and the banking networks, captured value at every stage. Facilitating trust was never a public service, it was a business model. The temple took its share of the grain, the guild charged its fees, the banker earned his commission. The infrastructure of trust has always been owned by someone, and the people who own it have always been among the wealthiest in whatever system they operate within. If the idea that writing, banking, and international finance all trace back to a farmer depositing grain in a Mesopotamian temple just reframed how you see the financial system you live inside, hit the like button and subscribe so this reaches more people. Now, every trade system in history has only been as stable as the political environment surrounding it. And when that stability collapses, the pressure to build something new produces innovations that reshape the world. When the Ottoman Empire's expansion in the 15th century made overland routes to Asia more costly, the incentive to find alternatives became overwhelming. That incentive funded Vasco da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, opening the sea route to India and triggering the explosion of European maritime trade. But maritime trade introduced a new version of the trust problem. Trading between entirely different empires with different legal systems, different currencies, and different norms around contract enforcement was an almost entirely different challenge. The solution emerged in the Italian city-states of the 13th and 14th centuries. The merchants of Florence, Venice, and Genoa developed the bill of exchange, a financial instrument that allowed a merchant in Florence to pay for goods in Bruges without sending coins across the Alps, without trusting a stranger with physical coin, and without needing both parties to be in the same place at the same time. A merchant paid a bank in Florence. The bank issued a letter. That letter, presented to a partner bank in Bruges, resulted in payment in local currency. The settlement between the two banks happened separately, through ongoing commercial relationships. This was not just a convenient payment method, it was the invention of foreign exchange, the very foundation of correspondent banking, the first functional system for international trade finance. And it emerged not from government planning, but from merchants solving a practical problem. How do you move value across borders without physically moving the value? By the 17th century, trade had grown complex enough that governments started paying serious attention. The dominant theory was mercantilism. A nation's wealth was measured by its accumulated gold and silver, and trade policy should focus on exporting as much as possible, while importing as little as possible. Run a surplus, accumulate bullion, grow rich. The policies this produced were deeply counterproductive. Britain prohibited its American colonies from manufacturing finished goods, forcing them to import from the home country at marked up prices. A policy that generated resentment so deep it helped fuel a revolution. Every pound spent on foreign goods was treated as a pound of national wealth leaving the country, when in reality the goods received in exchange had their own value. Then Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and David Ricardo formalized comparative advantage in 1817. The core insight from this is trade is not zero-sum. Even if one country can produce everything more efficiently, both countries benefit from specialization and exchange. Portugal should make wine. England should make cloth. Both end up with more of both. This idea became the intellectual foundation of free trade. It is largely correct. with one complication the textbook version tends to gloss over. Comparative advantage works at the level of nations in aggregate. It does not guarantee that every individual benefits. A country that shifts from manufacturing to services may see GDP grow, while specific communities that depended on manufacturing are devastated. The nation wins, the town loses, and the people in the town are not particularly comforted by the aggregate GDP figure. This tension was understood as early as the 18th century. It has never been resolved, which is why trade policy remains one of the most politically charged subjects in every democratic country on Earth. By the 20th century, nations developed a new tool for measuring trade relationships: the trade deficit. A country imports more than it exports. The number is tracked obsessively and used in political arguments with a frequency that suggests it's among the most important indicators in existence. Here's the misunderstanding that shapes most of those arguments. A trade deficit is not automatically bad. The United States has run one almost continuously since 1976, and for large portions of that period has been the wealthiest nation on Earth. When the US imports more than it exports, dollars flow out. Those dollars don't disappear. They return as investment, purchases of treasury bonds, acquisitions of US assets. The trade deficit is matched by a capital account surplus. The country exchanges goods for investment. Whether that's a good deal depends on what the investment finances, not on the deficit figure itself. Persistent deficits in specific sectors can hollow out industrial capacity and create strategic vulnerabilities. The debate is legitimate, but it cannot be conducted honestly using the framing that deficit equals loss and surplus equals gain. Because at the level of national economies, it is almost never that simple. Every price you have ever paid for something made in another country is the endpoint of a chain that begins with two neighbors and a simple idea. What I have and what you have together is worth more than what either of us has alone. The clay tablet became the bill of exchange. The bill of exchange became the wire transfer. The caravan route became the container ship. The guild reputation system became the international trade court. Each generation inherited the trust problem and built a new mechanism to solve it. That idea is 5,000 years old. It is still the most powerful economic force on Earth. And the first time anyone thought it was important enough to record, they pressed a reed into wet clay and counted grain. Everything since has been a footnote to that tablet.